Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and Judd Zulgad is joining me because I am launching a new little bit we're going to do here on the show because it is June and there isn't much breaking news outside of delusional Packers fans thinking that their players are going to be better than Justin Jefferson online. So we don't deal in delusions here, but we do deal in Vikings history. So each week we're going to look at a random old game of the week, and it truly is random. I just started asking people, hey, give me a game that Vikings fans might not remember but was actually awesome. And our friend Sam Ekstrom said, you got to go back and look at that '09 game between the Vikings and Baltimore Ravens. And of course, Judd, you were covering this game, so we're going to talk all about this and maybe make some comparisons to modern day, go through some of the things that we would have remembered from this game, but then also things that we didn't because both of us watched this back, and we'll have a fun time. And I think this is better than going through classic games that everyone remembers, because watching this back, this was an amazing game. And also this is a mid-October game in 2009, but a turning point to be able to say, like, wow, this Vikings team is not only 6-0 after beating Baltimore. Spoiler alert, we're going to cover wins, but also the offense taking this huge explosion with Brett Favre, and he's throwing rockets and fastballs everywhere. And it feels like it was kind of one of those, hey, the Vikings are really for real with this offense. So a really fun game, Judd, to go back and watch.
And so just to set this up too, what this was 2009. Favre, of course, joins he's not going to join the team. He's not going to join the team. Joins the team, shockingly, after the Mankato portion of training camp. And the first two games, the Vikings won against Cleveland, and at Detroit. And those two games were like Favre was fine, but he wasn't outstanding. And it was sort of the Adrian Peterson show. And so I remember at the time writing, hey, Brett Favre is clearly returned here to become a game manager. He's doing a great job. Like, this is the new Brett Favre. And then, of course, the home opener, week 3, San Francisco, the Greg Lewis game, that all changes. And so this is where we firmly, I think, by week 6 got into the, oh my God. Like, Brett Favre is now, that's the San Fran win was incredibly impressive, but that's one game. So this, now we're to a point where at 6-0, it's like, oh, the vengeance, the Favre vengeance is real. And so this game was a very defining, important game because I think it really signified just how much Favre was going to chase a potential MVP and how much he was not brought into, in his mind, manage the game. He was brought in to try and whoop teams, including his former Packers team twice.
Folks, I've been wearing Oakleys now for a few weeks, and let me tell you, there is a reason that Justin Jefferson and a bunch of other football players wear these things. Because they are awesome. I've got the matte black Prism Sapphire polar sunglasses on, and I've been doing all sorts of summer things with them. I've been hitting golf balls in the water, jogging, playing basketball, getting sunburned, but my eyes are in good shape. I have been missing out on this experience for a long time. They are so comfortable. I can wear them all day and never get tired of having them on. Oakley is changing the game, and it's time for you to discover a whole new world of possibilities with your eyewear. They are suited for everyday eyewear with frames and lenses, allowing you to be an extension of yourself, an expression of your personality more than meets the eye. So make a sunglasses upgrade now at Oakley.com. Oakley offers prism lens technology. What the heck is that, you ask? Well, I'm looking through it right now. It is a proprietary technology to Oakley and available for everyday settings as well. If you want to know more, and I know you do, go to Oakley.com and do your own research. And while you're at it, get yourself a pair of everyday glasses that will be sure to change your look for the better. When you wear Oakley, there really is more than meets the eye. Try it for yourself. I've worn sunglasses in the past, and I can assure you that Oakley is the best looking and best quality out there. So go on over to Oakley.com for more information today. Oakley, express your style and build a look that's made for you. And just a note before we get deeper into this, when it comes to Brett Favre and also Ray Rice, we're just going to focus on the football players here and not anything else involving Brett Favre and Ray Rice, because Ray Rice had an amazing game that we need to talk about as well. So this one starts out with Brett Favre and the Vikings offense just jumping all over the Ravens, and they start up 17-3. Something that I really noticed, though, Judd, because I want to make observations across the board also about the playing style, that team, Favre himself, and everything we kind of learned from rewatching this game. And also, this takes you a little behind the scenes for both of us, that we have hobbies of going back and watching old games. So this is how I would talk to you about this on the sidelines at TCO Performance Center after I watched some old game. But what I noticed the most about this offense that I didn't remember or really realize is how involved the big people were. So as Kevin O'Connell's going back and saying, how can I use that Josh Oliver? How can I use my 2 tight end systems? Can I mix in a CJ Ham successfully this year? I was surprised because I didn't realize it was Visanthe Shenko, Klein Saucer's out there. They're running a fullback at a lot of times, and defenses are having to load up. And then he just kept whipping the ball to either CJ Wright or not CJ, Sidney Rice, or Visanthe Shenko, or checking it down to tight ends. But I didn't realize how much big personnel they were using in that offense.
So, and this was classic Brett too. So in the 90s, if you go back, Brett actually, absolutely in Green Bay loved his tight ends. Mark Chmura, Keith Jackson, who came from Philadelphia. And so, Shenko, who was signed, I think as a free agent in 2007, and was a complete bust that year. He couldn't catch the ball. It was terrible. He had become, by 2009, an instrumental part of the offense, and Favre loved his tight ends. And the thing that I had covered in 2000, I think it was 3, the first of my 2 years on the Packer beat, was Sidney Rice became his Javon Walker. Like, Brett always had the ability to turn one guy into this unbelievable career season, oh my God, Pro Bowl player. And the year that I had covered the Packers in 03, Javon Walker went from this high draft pick, sort of a bust, to phenomenal year. Well, in this case, it was Rice, who, if I'm not mistaken, had been a second-round pick, had been injured a ton, real disappointment, and Brett Favre at some point in time decided, I'm going to make this guy. And so it very much fit the Favre template, and we all know, too, Brett Favre loved his big men. He loved the fullbacks. He loved the tight ends. So this was sort of quintessential Favre at his best, which is, I'm going to get everybody involved, and I'm also going to use tight ends, fullbacks as much as I possibly can. Where at this point in time, too, I think the league was sort of going not away from that, but certainly not everyone was doing it. Brett Favre didn't care.
Yeah, it was definitely going more toward 3 wide receiver already in 2009. Sometimes we talk about, a decade and a half ago as if it was like 1993, but offenses had already started to modernize, and we were coming out a little bit. And that's what's sort of ironic about the Adrian Peterson era, is it is on the coattails of where running backs had peaked in the early 2000s with your Sean Alexanders and so forth. And he's coming out of that. So he's like that next wave as the league is starting to shift over to the passing. But I feel like it also made life hellacious on defenses to have Favre with the ability to throw in between linebackers the way he did, and also have these big men out there. And that's the thing about Favre that maybe we don't give him enough credit for in hindsight, is how good he was at knowing when to check down. I mean, he's famous for the interceptions that he's forcing the ball, but 90% of the time he's making a lot of really good decisions in this game. Oh, yeah. And I also had the thought about Sidney Rice, because he is one of the all-time kind of one-year wonders, maybe not in NFL history, but definitely in Viking history. And there's a play early in the game where he runs kind of a slant over the middle, and Favre throws the fastest football that has ever been launched by any human being, and it just sticks to Sidney Rice. And I think Dan Deerdorf, which is interesting because they're playing the Ravens, so it's Deerdorf and Gumbel, which probably never called Vikings game, and they're like, what a catch. And it was like, was it what a catch, or did that just stick in him like a dartboard? I mean, it was amazing how he made this guy who had a relatively average skill set, and there's nothing he does in this game that blows you away, except for Favre is just putting it on him over and over and over again into these tight windows.
Can we talk about also Favre's, not just his release of the football, but his footwork to make throws, where he sets himself, and like every throw, I went back and watched it, and I had forgotten this. It's like, how did he not throw his shoulder out on that throw? Like his plant and throw, and like you can see why at key times it cost him, because his confidence, to what you're saying about threading the ball in there, was so high because he threw fastballs. Like those are like Roger Clemens fastballs. But I just think his footwork and his plant to throw is so interesting because, you know, the majority of guys now, a lot of them have good arms, but does anybody have that like violent a footwork? It was almost like Favre was jumping and throwing, and it's like I honest to God thought like 3 times, how did his arm not just like come out of the socket there? I love going back and watching it because I don't think we've seen a lot of guys, especially now, who have the mechanics that Brett Favre did.
I don't know of almost anybody. There's sort of these relics of how to do things as a quarterback. There used to be the straight drop back. So when you watch John Elway, you're like, what is he doing? Why is he dropping straight back with his shoulders? Or the Warren Moon opposite drop back, where he would drop back and his shoulders would be pointing toward his left, and then he would spin around and throw. Like nobody would do that now. You'd probably get sacked like 500 times if you were trying to do that anyway. And Favre had this. Remember how relievers who threw 97, now it looks like, 97, they're just flinging it in there.
Right.
But they used to fall off the side of the mound, and you'd always have some broadcaster in baseball being like, well, you know, he throws hard, but he can't field his position because he's fallen off to the side. That's what Favre looks like in this. And I was also amazed, too, at how open some of the guys were. And I guess you could speak to this because like the offensive scheme obviously did not carry through with Chili from year to year to year. And a part of that is just Favre falling off and injuries and everything else the following season. But Shanko and Bernard Berrien, I mean, these guys are wide open for touchdowns in this game. Was it like the league being a little surprised by the way they were using Favre, or was like Brad Childress better at his job than we remember? Or was it Favre just making the right decisions? Because it seems like in this game, the Ravens shouldn't have a bad defense, and yet there's guys wide open all over the place.
I think it's a few things. I think one thing was, you know, Brad Childress came here and put in the West Coast, as he said, kick-ass offense. But the reality is, like, Brett was the professor of that. By this point in time, Brett Favre, like, I'm sure Brad called plays, okay? But Favre checked to things. Favre knew exactly what he was doing. So I hesitate to give Brad a lot of credit. It was basically Brett who ran the show. And by this time, keep in mind, too, Darrell Bevel was actually calling plays. And Bev and Favre were tight. And so it was basically, hey, Brett, go be Brett. But I know what you're talking about, and there is no question about it. I think that flat out, and it's what, 2009 to now, 13 years or so, 14 years after the fact. I think there is no question, and I saw this on both sides too, and I guess I didn't appreciate it at the time or now as much as I did in watching this, Matthew, but, to call a spade, cornerback play wasn't that good. Like in this game, cornerback play, and look, there were certain corners at the time who were very good. I'm not saying that there weren't. But I feel like a lot of corners now who probably aren't considered shutdown guys are probably far more skilled. And if you go back and watch the Vikings defense in that game, same thing. I mean, Joe Flacco is schooling them. And, I at the time, not a bad player. But as I recall, Benny Sapp got a lot of playing time back then. And I don't know that Benny Sapp would qualify to play in the league in any type of role today. And so I think it's a combination of things. I think it's arm strength. I think it is the fact that Brett was, Shanko was good. Rice was, great that season. Percy Harvin was a guy that had to be accounted for constantly. Berrien at that time was pretty doggone good. So I think it was also difficult. But flat out, I know exactly what you're saying. And I'm going to say, I think cornerback play in 2009, probably not near what it is as far as competency now in 2023.
Yeah, and in this game, Percy Harvin kind of a non-factor, which I think if I told you that they were going to score 33 points, that he basically did nothing in this game, you'd be pretty surprised. Well, you're ahead of me a little bit in my notes because one of the things I wrote down as in this game, the Ravens start to come back. And the reason is because of the secondary with the Vikings. Yes. But this is really telling about football a little bit. I think it's a good example to like how I would explain this. A few years ago, PFF put out something that sort of showed that the secondary performance had more to do with your overall success as a defense than your pass rush. And I think people got like a little weird about that because pass rush does affect the secondary. But maybe, good example here where Jared Allen is getting after Joe Flacco time after time after time. He is getting beat up through this entire game, and it does not matter. He's pushing the ball down the field. Also, early career Joe Flacco, what a cannon. I don't think he was the most accurate, and he missed, oh my gosh, he missed a couple of wide open throws in this game.
The deep throw.
You're like, yes, where the guy's just running completely free, but he gets smacked on the play. And there's a bunch of plays in this game where he gets crushed. And I think this was one of the, like, if there was one weakness to this all-time great Vikings team led by Favre and led by Jared Allen on the defensive side, it was the secondary. And you saw it there, how you can't just stop a quarterback from hitting people, even if he's getting beat up a little when receivers are wide open.
I'm not sure what the PFF grades were at the time, or if they've gone back and done them. But, Cedric Griffin, number 23, was a key cornerback on that team. And I'm going to tell you right now, not that good. As I recall, Tyrell Johnson, who I think was a second-round pick in 2008, was at safety. Not that good. So, yes, there's no question that Vikings team, for the most part, and they had a ton of success doing it, often had to outscore teams. Like they could stop the run really, really well, which they had a 4-year period where phenomenal because of the Williams wall against the run. But there's no question that secondary was a little bit scary. And that's where Favre came in, because Favre, as we see in this game, can basically say, okay, screw it. And that's the thing, too. It's hard to appreciate now, and we saw this to Kirk's credit and O'Connell's credit last season. But, Matthew, how long did we watch Vikings games where that type of fourth quarter comeback was really, really rare? Like Brett Favre, they go down. Brett Favre's not like, oh my God, we're down. He's like, yeah, let's go. And you can see it. And I think the thing is, at the end of 2007, in his last year as a Packer, when he threw that awful pick against the Giants in the conference title game at Lambeau, and then, of course, at the end of 2009, same thing against the Saints, Favre had such superior confidence in his arm that he made dumb throws. But like in this game, you're exactly right. I mean, there were a lot of really sound, really great throws. Brett Favre certainly had some problems when he got overconfident and the pressure was on and he tried to be the difference. But there were a lot of games where he flat out was the difference. And this game is like a perfect example of a game that Favre took by the throat and said, we're not going to lose.
So to your question on the cornerbacks, the top three guys with the most coverage snaps graded by PFF out of 100, 63, 64, and 57. So it was not the most banner year for the cornerbacks. I am curious how many turnover-worthy plays Brett Favre had in 2009, because it at least by the traditional numbers, it is his safest season. Wow. He only had 11 turnover-worthy plays the entire year, which was one of the best in the entire league. That's like Phillip Rivers and Drew Brees. That's actually better than Drew Brees that year. And consider that Drew Brees had the number one offense and barely turned the ball over ever. Remarkable for him that season, because normally Favre was such a risk taker that he would have higher numbers on that. And I haven't ever looked at the 2009 PFF grades because it does go back to 2008. So it's kind of enlightening, because sometimes that's just pure fluke. That's just like, oh, the guy only had 5 interceptions, but had 12 dropped interceptions, which happens all the time. And not to jump around too much, but on the final drive for Favre, where they take the lead before, I won't spoil the ending because it's fun if you don't remember it. But he makes this throw where he gets out of the pocket, escapes a little bit of pressure, and just launches it to Sidney Rice.
Yes.
Like every bit of his arm talent is just on display, but also the moxie there, where it's like you could try to kind of methodically work your way down the field. He's just like, nah, this is Brett time, and he completes. I think it's like a 64-yard pass or something to set up a go-ahead score there at the end. But just kind of circling back, something that stuck out to me that is funny now is Stephen Hauschka, 29-yard field goal. Vikings get up 20-10. Ryan Longwell, 22-yard field goal following another bomb to Sidney Rice that Favre had. Do you ever wonder how many points teams would have scored, like the 98 Vikings and the 09 Vikings, if they just didn't kick stupid, senseless field goals and let Brett Favre try to throw a touchdown?
It's funny, too, because Favre's entire career was basically played in an era where they did kick the field goal. So it's like, I think that question applies to a bunch of Favre's career. But yeah, it's remarkable how much the game has changed as far as the philosophical thinking as well, just since then. Because yeah, you're right. They're kicking these field goals that in retrospect you'd probably go for it now, or at least you would some of the time. Now, a guy like Childress, I'm not sure he would consistently, but he probably should. And then the funniest thing too is the one thing, and I think I texted you this, Justin Tucker doesn't lose this game. I mean, Stephen Hauschka had been Longwell's understudy, I think the year before, in training camp. And in fact, they jokingly called him Victor the Viking, the team mascot, because he was just like always around and they had no idea what he was doing. But yeah, that's another thing. The legs now. Stephen Hauschka replaced by a guy like Tucker. Baltimore leaves with a win.
Well, you think about Ryan Longwell, and I'm going to look this up right now. I have all my notes on my phone, so that's why I keep looking down. But he made 83% of his kicks, Ryan Longwell. And he's one of the best kickers of all time when he retires. If he was playing now, he'd be fighting with Greg Joseph in camp to try to get a job at that percentage. I'm sure he'd be better now.
Right.
In the same way that any player from another era, if they were playing now, they have all the same advantages, kicking coaches and everything else. And whatever, I don't know how different the K balls are now from 09 or so forth, but Greg Joseph, that's like what he has for a career. He has like 84%. And there's no one that would ever think of Greg Joseph in the same breath as Ryan Longwell for excellence. So yes, Stephen Hauschka does miss a potential game-winning field goal that wasn't that far away, maybe 45 yards, something like that he ends up missing it. And, that's how the Vikings get this win. So they were up 27-10 in this game, and they allow the Ravens to come back. And I have to say that I do miss a little bit the old school, and this was just, again, on the kind of edge of this, running back battles. This was a great one. This was, and sometimes I get frustrated a little bit, Judd, with the running backs don't matter sort of thing, where it's like, it's not that running backs don't matter. It's that running backs are usually replaceable and have short peaks, and you probably shouldn't pay them second contracts. It's not that you can just go out and have any old Ontario Smith play instead of Adrian Peterson or something, right? It's not that. It's usually about the price tag and how short their windows for success usually are and how beat up they get. So just to clear that, but running backs mattered in this game. I forgot with Ray Rice how thick he was. He was like shifty, Barry Sanders kind of shifty at times, but also dudes bounce off him. And with Adrian Peterson, and then this is what I want to talk about a little bit with Adrian Peterson, because Ray Rice begins the comeback. He's got this 22-yard touchdown where the Vikings are just falling off of him. For a guy who's like 5'7" or something.
It's pathetic, though, man.
Wild. Yeah,
the lack of tackling on that.
I can just hear a young Judd Zulgad in the press box being like, look at this tackling, Scoggins, what are they doing? But Adrian at this time I think his 09 season is kind of interesting. It's not the best statistical season. He is a little bit more used by Favre on those checkdowns and things like that. But when you see the way he was able to accelerate and the attention that he still was drawing, like that brought it together. And this was one of his best games of that season where he broke out for multiple big runs. And then you see throughout the game so much attention being drawn to him.
And it became a AP cliche, and it applies to Rice as well. But the violence which they run with, like the absolute head of steam, like dare to tackle me. But I mean, this was, in Peterson's entire time here, there were certainly far more impressive statistical years. But it was the perfect year because he had a quarterback with a bunch of weapons. You couldn't just stack the box or Brett Favre would rip you apart, as you saw. Because teams basically picked their poison a lot and said, we are not going to let 28 beat us, which is fine, but then 4 is going to. So we get so caught up in stats then and now, right? Like with Kirk. Oh, his stats were down in 2022. But they won 13 games. I'll take 13 wins over garbage time crappy stats. And that was the Peterson thing too. I mean, this was the perfect season offensively because he was an absolute bell cow, probably at that time the best running back in the entire league. The Vikings had a tight end that could block, a tight end that could catch, Harvin, and the only thing now is, what if you were to put that offense in today's game with Percy? Because that's my other question. I mean, Percy Harvin was used in a lot of different sort of packages, but that would be the uptick now would be so different. Percy Harvin would be an absolute nightmare now. But this offense had a lot, including a really solid line going for it.
And I think the first 3 years of Percy Harvin are 3 of the most impressive to start a season. And then it just never materialized for many reasons after that. But with the fact that offensive coordinators have gotten even more creative, and I think they really were with Harvin. Sometimes it's like we kind of fall in love with some new trend and forget that people were doing it before or that it came and went. And with Harvin, there are times where he lined up in the backfield, actually quite a bit. And they moved him around. Chester Taylor makes a few appearances in this. So teams using guys to their strengths and their situations. And Harvin was a guy that they would put in the slot. Now we talk all about slot receivers, underneath passes to get the ball in guys' hands. And again, that didn't happen a lot in this game because Favre was either throwing shorts with tight end or launching the ball. But I also think that the big personnel, the personnel versatility where they could bring in Harvin and Berrien, or they could go to the 2 tight ends. I thought that made things really difficult on the defense, especially from a running perspective, because they could run out of any of those looks. And I just think when we remember Adrian Peterson, we're going to remember the long runs and everything else. But the fear of God that man struck into a defense every time. And they did have a very good offensive line in 2009. And you just see how little space he needed to be at full speed. That's the thing that you just, in your mind, you kind of remember like, oh, it was great, or you see some highlight reels or whatever. But when you see play to play, a 5-yard gain, but how fast that happens with him. And when we were talking about like the Mount Rushmore of Vikings running backs and everything, it's like just a reminder watching this game. Oh yeah, it's Adrian and then like 100 miles. And we can then start talking about those other Viking running backs. It's just so not even close. But the farther we get away from it, if we're not seeing like Randy Moss highlights every day on Twitter, right, it's easy to kind of forget what that looks like. And I think this was a nice refresher to be like, wow, at his peak, because the last time I saw him was 2016, and that was not similar to the version that was in 09.
No, and the only thing that Peterson struggled with back then was actually being patient enough to wait for his blocks. So if he did, he was unstoppable. And that's why, so he always said that he didn't really like having a fullback that much, but they often had one because he could follow him. In fact, in his rookie year here, 2007, if I'm not mistaken, it might have been the one and only season of Tony Richardson, the fullback who had been with the Jets and Chiefs and was a consummate professional. And basically at one point in time, Tony just said, follow me, just follow me. Like wherever I go, you go, because I know when to wait and I know how to block. And so like if you gave Peterson the map, he was damn near unstoppable. And this game totally shows that. Absolutely shows that.
Yeah, this is just a complete unstoppable offensive performance on the whole for both teams. I had a great moment in the fourth quarter, early in the fourth quarter of, and tell me if you had some of this, remember that guy moment. And for me, that was Mark Clayton. but not the Mark Clayton that played for
Right.
the Dolphins, who was
Yep.
an excellent player, but the Mark Clayton who was basically like just a guy for the Ravens, but had this flash in '06 where he caught like 60 passes or something. He was, but it was like, wait, remember the other Mark Clayton? And then Derek Mason shows up and he catches a touchdown. And again, like the Vikings defense is just flailing and falling apart at this point. But Mark Clayton and Derek Mason catching touchdowns in this game was definitely my, like, this is why we watch old games, to remember guys like that moments.
And Todd Heap, right? At tight end?
Yes.
For Baltimore, Todd Heap. Yes. I had forgotten about. And you know what? At that time, that guy, as I recall, was pretty damn good. But I'd completely forgotten about him. And was the blindside guy the left tackle who was trying to block Jared?
Yes, and getting
Michael Orr,
killed.
right?
Michael Orr was
he was just getting
murdered.
I mean, Jared, that's the thing too is, you know, for all we can and should praise guys like Favre and AP, you forget just, I mean, that addition in 2008 in the trade with KC, you forget what a monumental seismic shift that was for a team that hadn't had a guy that could rush from the right end. I mean, Erasmus James, Udeza. Like the last guy who had successfully gotten home quite a bit before Jared Allen was Lance Johnstone, who was a situational guy. Like he was a third down rusher. And then you get Jared, who one, won't come out of games, and two, spent his entire afternoon back then in the backfield. Like that, his game, when you go back and watch that, it is, if it's not dominance, it borders on dominance.
Actually, I wonder if I can look up how many pressures Jared Goff, or not Jared Goff, why would I call him Jared Goff? Jared Allen had in that game. I know he had, over the season, he had 64 pressures, which is a pretty good season at the time. Yeah, he should be offended by that. Let me look this up. So it gives him 5, which is a really good game, along with a sack, couple of hits, couple of tackles. I would argue that the total impact from Jared Allen was more significant than 5, but I mean, 5 is still a great game. If you did that every game, you'd be incredible. So, and that's why Flacco's performance is so wild to me, and really tells you about score effects a little bit, because they're down 27-10, and Flacco finishes the game with 385 and 2 touchdowns. The Vikings start to melt. And here's where I had another thought, though, because Ray Rice catches a touchdown toward the end. They take the lead 31-30. But something I thought of was how we don't really have a Dan Dierdorf broadcaster anymore. Like there was a kind of a run, and I think this was part because of John Madden, but also Dierdorf was great, where it was just these football guys. And Dan Dierdorf is just losing his mind at this point when they're coming back. And I used to really enjoy the intensity of Dan Dierdorf, and I haven't listened to a Dierdorf game in quite some time. So they had this really kind of, it was clear that they were trying to repeat like the Summerall and Madden, just with another, you know, big guy and a kind of a smooth broadcaster. So you have the like Percy Harvin, you know, kind of calls, or Derek Mason, where it's not like this huge call from the play-by-play guy. And then Dierdorf comes flying in with just the most intense football commentary. They were kind of going that way with Tony Romo, and then maybe lost their way a little bit. But it feels like the personality, but big, massive football guy has kind of been lost. I don't know if you like Dierdorf, but I loved Dierdorf growing up.
Actually, you know what? He was really, really good. I remember, so he was working at KMOX radio in St. Louis when he was a Cardinals, as I recall, offensive lineman, and he transitioned right to the booth with CBS. Then he got the Monday Night Football gig, and then when he left there, went back to CBS. And as I recall at that time, if I'm not mistaken, their number one team was Nance and Sims, I think. I think Phil Sims was the top team. But yeah, I've always contended this. So like that Madden group had to be offensive or defensive linemen or linebackers. Because Matt Millen, if you recall, before he took the Lions job, he was in line to be the next, you know, John Madden. Like, and, you know, with the sound effects, Dierdorf was not as exaggerated as Madden was especially as Madden progressed and became almost at times a caricature of himself. But yes, it's great. In fact, there's the one call where it's right before a huge Peterson run, and Dierdorf goes, "Yeah, it's Adrian Peterson time." And then the next thing, Gumbel's like, "Hey, Adrian Peterson's gonna lose," and then you go, "Oh man, yeah, and yeah." It's great. I sort of miss that just in a vacuum. I don't miss it every week, but it feels like now, announcer-wise, right? It's gone to more of the quarterbacks and like the cerebral guys, as opposed to the guys who are just like, just get in the dirt and show me some football.
Yeah, and you had the Brian Baldingers. They were trying to develop
Baldy.
the kind of next guy like that with a Kevin, what was his name? Kevin Moss or something, like this former Chiefs offensive lineman. Like they were always trying to find the next John Madden. I don't think they ever really
Bill Moss.
found it, but Bill Moss.
I think it was
Okay,
Bill
yeah.
Moss. Yeah, just a big gruff had just kicked. And this is back when those guys didn't immediately retire and drop 80 pounds. So
yeah, right.
So they'd come in the booth and you'd be like, "Yeah, I remember that guy." Now it's like, who's that? That's Steve Hutchinson. He weighs about $120.
Yeah, I know. I saw Steve out at TCO. I'm sure you did too, and it does not look like he used to. And Joe Thomas is the ultimate example of that. I watching an old game the other day, and just even the close up on his face, like that's not Joe Thomas now or anywhere close. But anyway, I thought you're right that he could be so intense that you'd be like, okay, stop. That was a 3-yard run. You need to stop losing your mind. There is a play in this game that also is reflective of sign of the times. Kelly Washington, kind of a random receiver for the Ravens, goes over the middle and just gets laid out. And of course, Dierdorf's like, awesome hit, great job, whatever. I think today there's flags coming from every part of the field.
Oh, yeah.
Roger Goodell probably runs on the field and pulls the safety off of, out of the dome at that, if that had happened now. But also, I'm glad they've gotten rid of those hits. I know it's really hard for the safeties, and this was a big debate with Harrison Smith a couple of years ago when it seemed like the league was kind of out to get him a little bit for the head hunting. But those types of hits, like you watch how hard Kelly Washington gets smacked. And that was just routine and something you could totally do. Oh, yeah. And I think he stayed in the game, which was not a good idea. And they used to do that a lot more. And it's amazing how far we've come in a short period of time, because to me, and I'm sure to you, 2009 doesn't feel like that long ago. And yet we could kind of see those reflections of how the game is different. So then Favre comes up with this incredible throw to Sidney Rice to put them ahead 33-31. And then here comes the Ravens again. Hauschka gets the kick, misses the kick. The Vikings go to 6-0. What was the feeling when they won this game? Because, I mean, obviously, like, from an objective standpoint, there's stuff to criticize here. You let them back in the game and so forth. But it's 6-0. And I remember the 2016 5-0 and what that felt like. 6-0 had to feel like this team is legit.
Yes, in fact, I believe the next week 7, they went to Pittsburgh and lost their first game, but that was quickly erased by the Monday night game against the Packers and Aaron Rodgers at the Metrodome, which was, so I had forgotten, or perhaps I just didn't pay attention, how bad the Vikings defense was in this particular game. Because we were also, and not surprisingly, so caught up in the Favre magic carpet ride experience. And it was cool. Look, I mean, it took weeks, well beyond week 6 of 2009, to acclimate yourself to seeing Brett Favre in purple. Seeing Brett Favre still come out in Lambeau and get as booed as loud as anyone I've ever heard get booed in a Vikings jersey still remains one of the most jarring things of my career, because it just didn't, like, it doesn't make sense in your brain. So I think there was nothing but excitement, because it's like, and again, keep in mind, in this town, how many guys, in the last, I don't know, now 20 years or so, how many guys have taken the football or baseball or puck or basketball and said, we're not going to lose? Because you had the feeling when the Vikings, that the incredible thing is, it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a surprise, and in part because we had seen Favre do that to the Vikings. But I hearken back to 91, Game 7, Jack Morris. He doesn't come out. He stays in. Incredible win. If you're of a certain age now, it's almost damn near impossible, and you were probably pretty small if born in 2009, but it's probably really, really doggone hard to appreciate that, like appreciate the cockiness. For his Kirk, 8 comeback wins in the fourth quarter, but 1 that was off the charts weird for Kirk. Like, that's not the normal Kirk. And 2, there wasn't this hubris from Kirk. Like, there was this Favre sauntered back on the field, starting with that ridiculous week 3 pass to Greg Lewis to end the game and give the Vikings a win. Favre saunters on the field, and it's just like, oh yeah, my arm, I got this. And so, for as bad as the defense, and again, I had forgotten, as bad as the defense looked in that game, it wasn't a concern when you had Brett Favre and a team that at that point in time, and for a long time, I think, looked like a team of destiny. As far as the Vikings teams I've covered, because I didn't technically cover the 98 team, this is easily the biggest letdown. Like 17, which we covered together, was fun. And I was surprised they got blown out. But I wasn't shocked they didn't get to the Super Bowl. This is the one where I've always said, I think if they make the Super Bowl, I think they beat the Colts. Because they had enough firepower that it was certainly not unrealistic. And again, if you go back to the conference championship game in 2009 and look at the stats, the Vikings kicked the Saints' ass. So it wasn't like when we covered the game with a link and it's like, what the hell is this? It was you should have won that game. But yeah, this was just like, the season, until the end when it got sort of weird, the season just kept crescendoing at this point, and this was another in the markers, the checkpoints of, oh my God, this team is legit and Brett Favre is great.
Yeah. Well, first, you're giving me way too much credit for my age. I was 23 when this happened, so I do remember this season quite well. Okay. But I appreciate that because I have, with my birthday coming up, I have been feeling a little bit old recently.
Well, I'm glad to help you out. But I mean, there's a lot of young Vikings fans who would have, just a sort of a recollection, perhaps, of this team. And I'm just saying, when's the last time in this town we literally had a guy say, I'm not going to lose this game. And you believed him.
Yeah, that's totally right. And, I guess what I'm curious about from you, though, because I wouldn't have lived here and don't have quite the perspective on that season, the cynicism level of Minnesota sports fans right now, which I totally understand is well earned by the teams, as they are told by, new regime after new regime that this time it's going to be different. But last year I felt it big time. And look, I was at the center of it when they're going 13-4 and we're talking about negative point differential. And every time they played a great team, they got their doors blown off in the second half of the season. And then the loss. But after the loss in Green Bay, I just felt the entire wind go out of the sails of the Vikings fan base because they knew it wasn't going anywhere. And then they were right. And there's been so many times where it's like, even with the Twins or the Wolves, like, oh, you're playing Houston in the first round, huh? You're probably going to lose. And then they do. And the Twins, obviously, in their playoff lack of success, to put it very Minnesota nice. Was it that way then? Or is this like always been a thing? Or was that like everybody was just believing?
Boy, I feel like a lot of people believed. Now, I had covered Favre. So I had seen, now I did not cover the 2007 conference championship game meltdown against the Giants at Lambeau, but I did cover the 2003 playoff loss at Philadelphia, where I think the Packers went up 14-rip. That's the 4th and 26 game. But in overtime, don't forget, Favre threw what looked like a punt that was picked up, if I'm not mistaken, by Brian Dawkins, and Akers hit the field goal. And so I had seen Favre break hearts before. So I was actually not shocked that he broke hearts. I am shocked the Vikings fumbled like 4 times that day. Like there's a lot of factors to why the Vikings lost that game. But I want to say, Matthew, that it felt like there were a lot of people that really believed. I mean, offensively, that was a damn good team. And I guess my cynicism didn't come as much at that time from Minnesota sports, which it would now. It came from, I've seen Favre go down this path before. And, his career is littered with times he has decided to make decisions in huge games that are just baffling and just terrible, including that pass. But no, I think there were a lot of people that thought, to go back to 2009 and 98, I think there were a lot of people that thought, no, you know what? This team has a legit chance. And again, what's so frustrating is if you look at the damn box score from the Superdome, they did. They did. But I mean, Percy Harvin hadn't fumbled all year. He fumbled. Berrien had an inexplicable fumble. I mean, there were just so many things about that I think, I actually think that game has played a role in people being as guarded with their sports hearts as they are now.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that '09 and the certain amount of people in the huddle, which is illegal and gets you a 5-year penalty. Those things, I mean, that is, I don't think anything compares to Gary Anderson. I mean, there are a few things in all of sports from all the teams that compare to Gary Anderson. Not only hasn't missed all year, but that was the best team in football. It was historically great. But this Vikings team had an argument for being the best team in football and seemed to have that angel on its shoulder the entire year, especially on Brett's shoulder coming off of what happened in New York. But I agree with you that it would have been way less shocking maybe than Gary missing that he threw that interception. More having Vikings fans seen it many times in the playoffs, they probably went, oh no, it showed up. And I'm sure that even though they were trying to keep it out of their mind, that it was in the back of their mind that at some point Favre could throw that horrendous interception and cost them and not make the Super Bowl, because he had done that. And that's why he wasn't in Green Bay anymore, because if he had made one more Super Bowl, they never draft, another quarterback or whatever else. So he had kind of earned his way there a little bit, maybe like not of the same level of Case Keenum, where each week we were talking about it, though. It doesn't seem like that was the case.
No.
That, no pun intended there, that people would believe. But I think that played, by the time that I arrived in 2016, this fan base is so cynical about everything. And sometimes, and you're like the king leader of this movement, but But sometimes I'm sure that it can be, like, for fans, overwhelming. But I do think that this plays a big role. Is this, just to put a bow on it, I mean, I think that this was one of the peaks of that season, to see everything that they could be offensively. The 2009 season, is that in your mind clearly the second best team that the Vikings have had past the Super Bowl years to 1998?
The 87 team, which lost 3 consecutive games with replacement players, which wouldn't have lost those games, but unfortunately, the Vikings just didn't care. Like the strike hit, and they're like, yeah, we got to field a team. Where's Tony Adams to play quarterback? That team was actually really good. And that's the team, of course, that went and played the Saints and then blew the drawers off San Fran. AC and Anthony Carter, marvelous game. And then they lost on the Wade Wilson not so great pass, Darren Nelson drop. That team probably factors in, but I would say that was the second. I would say 2009 is second to me, just because you got the last gasp from Favre. And look, going into training camp, that team needed one position, quarterback. The quarterback would have been Tavares or Sage. And I've always said, the last practice in Mankato, before Brett shockingly came back after Mankato, the last practice, it's one of the worst practices I've seen. Balls were being skipped on the ground. But it was weird. In retrospect, we should have known something was up, because in retrospect, that practice got done and Childress wasn't angry. And it's like he knew. He knew. He's like, my guy is coming. But yeah, that's one of, like, I would say the heartbreaks on, if we were to break down NFC Championship season game heartbreaks, right? 98 is 1. 2009 to me, clearly 2. I personally think that the 2000, the 41 donut game is probably 3. And then I would put the 17 game, if I'm going to not use, because I would put 87 third if I included that, but that's now what, 40 years ago or 35 years ago. So Yeah, I would put this one 2009. I would put it clearly too, just because of the presence of Favre was basically supposed to be the magic potion, and ultimately Brett was Brett at the end of that.
Right. I don't think I've ever categorized 17 as heartbreaking so
Yeah,
much as just disappointing for everybody. Like one of
41
the
Donuts,
most,
same way, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah. There's
if you get your drawers blown off, I can't go heartbreak.
right. I thought that, well, the only thing that probably really hurts is that they started off the game with a marvelous drive and a touchdown pass to Kyle Rudolph. And then they actually got to stop and got the ball back. It was like, oh my gosh, are they going to the Super Bowl? And they're like, no, they're not going to the Super Bowl. But yeah, I agree with you. When you get smacked, then you just weren't worthy of facing the opponent. You had to go on the road anyway. And, it is what it is. I don't look at that as heartbreaking so much as just kind of, well, I guess you weren't good enough because you got absolutely killed. Last thing, is this your favorite season to cover of any that you ever covered? Oh no.
Oh, absolutely. It's not even close. It's not even close. And Favre was. I've always made this comparison. Favre was football's Elvis Presley. It was on a. I can't even explain it. Like he's not. He was a celebrity. Like he was not an athlete. He was not. It was not like, oh my God, he's really good. Peterson was a phenomenal talent. But Brett Favre was like going to Graceland. It was the most surreal thing to cover him, to have him do press conferences where he would get up and give you at least one or two scoops because he didn't like Brad much, and so he would purposely leak stuff. But it was like, I mean, it's as close as I've ever come to covering what would probably amount to a Hollywood celebrity. It was like that. And, in 2010, you had TMZ and at the time, Deadspin with the pictures and all that. But, I mean, that speaks to how important Favre was. And so, yes, it was the most fun. And it was the type of year where you're like, these aren't going to come around much. And I would argue that while 17 was fun, 17 didn't come close. Like, it wasn't close. The only similarities I see between 2009 and 2017 is with very different quarterbacks, the magic carpet ride came to an abrupt end. And look, when Favre threw that pick, I've told this story before, but I had told Doogie, I had said at my birthday party, I turned 40 that November, I had said, because Doog's like, he's going to be MVP, it's unbelievable. And I said, watch out. I said, he's going to break your heart. And after Favre threw that pick in the Superdome, Doogie was like 4 rows behind me in the old press box there. It's changed since. And before I did anything, I ran up, I grabbed him by the shoulders, and I said, I told you he would break your heart. And then fast forward, 17, how often on air did we talk about the Keenum thing is going to end, and it's going to end abruptly at some point? And we got like pushback. You guys are just bleep holes, blah, blah, blah. When that ball got tipped and returned for a touchdown, I remember I looked at you and you looked at me and we're like, there it was.
And the funny part about that is he also threw a there it was interception in the Minneapolis Miracle game that was forgotten, that opened the door for
Yes.
New Orleans to come back in. And
Great point.
that game, we also looked at each other and went, there it is.
That's a great point.
The one that Mike Zimmer was afraid of the entire season long. So anyway, well, this is the reason why I wanted to do a random old game of the week, because it's a very fun conversation, and I enjoyed both you and I going back, watching through that game, and talking about what we came away with from that one, and an incredible season to cover. So, Judd, great to get together with you again. I'm sure that we will do it at some point very soon when you are getting your suntan out at training camp in a few weeks. So I appreciate the time and you taking the time to go back and watch the game as well. And we'll talk again soon, man. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.